Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Varghese Korean Center of Excellence, IRMA, I welcome you all to the VKCoE interview series on the effect of COVID-19 in the dairy cooperative sector. This interview is the second in a series of interviews to gather inputs and insights on how diverse organizations in the cooperative and dairy sectors across different geographies are addressing COVID-19 related challenges. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, Varghese Korean Center of Excellence at IRMA has embarked on an exercise to get insights of policymakers, academicians, researchers, and management leaders in the cooperative and dairy sectors. The COVID-19 pandemic has put forth the challenge to not only understand how resilient the cooperative sector is in India, regionally, and globally, but also to explore how the sector is going to prepare itself to face the situation post pandemic. Today, we are in conversation with Shri Balasubramanian Iyer, Regional Director, International Cooperative Alliance, Asia Pacific. On behalf of the Varghese Korean Center of Excellence, I extend a warm welcome to Shri Balasubramanian Iyer. I'd also like to welcome Shri Mohit Dave, Program Manager, ICAAP. I am joined by Professor Harikrishna Mishra, Chair Professor VKCoE, and my colleagues from the communication team, Shri Sandeep Das and Shri Shivansh Mishra. Sir, before we begin the interview, I'd like to mention that the questions are indicative, keeping in mind the time duration of 30 minutes. But please feel free to add anything that you feel needs to be highlighted. I now hand over to my colleague Sandeep ji to begin the interview. Thank you.
Hi, sir. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And my first question would be what are the challenges the cooperative faced during this COVID pandemic, and what are the coping mechanisms they adopted globally in general and Asia Pacific to be specific enough.
Let me begin by thanking the Varghese Korean Center for Excellence, Professor Mishra, Shilpa, Sandeep, and Shivansh, and also my colleague Mohit, for giving the International Cooperative Alliance the opportunity to share the experiences of the cooperatives across the region in trying to address the COVID-19 and what they see in terms of moving ahead. Yesterday, we had a regional board meeting. It was an online board meeting, which we were doing for the first time. And toward the end, the conversation was about where should we have the next meeting. And one of the members volunteered saying, we can do it in my country the next time. But the unanimous view was that we should have a online video conference. The enthusiasm for a physical meeting is very dim. And this meeting is 7 months away. Even then, people seem to think that virtual is what we should be looking at. So that speaks to the new normal, where people are getting accustomed to do things online. And last week, we had a webinar where we invited most of our members from across the Asia Pacific region to get a sense of how they've been impacted and what the response would be. And in this webinar, we also had the ICA president, Ariel Guarco, and the ICA Asia Pacific president, Li Shunsheng from China. And during the conversation, Dr. Avasti, from the managing director of the Indian Farmers Fertilizer Cooperative, one of the largest fertilizer cooperatives, he mentioned that in their villages, they had to do a lot of awareness. Thankfully, the COVID's effect is much more in the urban areas rather than in rural areas, which is a positive. But even there, you have to go and talk to people, talk to farmers and the community about social distancing, need to keep space, wear masks, sanitize yourself. So the awareness, I think that's the other normal, that you need to have more of conversations about distancing. So while we are physically distancing ourselves, the virtual contact seems to be increasing. And that's one more of the new normal. Cooperatives, by virtue of being across all countries and across all sectors, have been impacted, though to a varying degree. When we look at agricultural cooperatives and allied cooperatives, they've been considered as essential in many countries. So they've been functioning, they've been stepping up and functioning. So have credit cooperatives because of the credit and the banking services, though liquidity and repayment has been an issue, but they've still been functional. And in many countries, the health cooperatives and social cooperatives, especially in Europe, where there are a large number of social cooperatives providing social services in education, health, and other areas, they've been quite active. But when we look at cooperatives in the services sector, like tourism, they've been badly affected. Similarly, many of the worker cooperatives have been affected because their units have been shut down. And so we are seeing job losses, we are seeing a loss of livelihoods. And of course, the migrants, and India is a good classic example of the impact that the migrant labor has had. So across the region, we've during the webinar, members have highlighted what they've done. For example, I'll start with India. You have the SEVA, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association, and their members many are from the informal sector. They look at the migrant workers. So they were the first ones to respond when they saw this situation across many of the states where they were working. And they have a health wing, the SEVA Lok Swasthya. And so that unit stepped up in terms of coming up with Ayurvedic sanitizers, and then women coming up stitching masks. We have a labor cooperative in the southern part of India, the Orolanga Labor Contract Cooperative Society. They've been affected because they are in the construction sector, and that's come to a stop. But then ULCCS is also into technology, and one of their startups was instrumental in the app which the government of Kerala is using. It's called GOK Direct to trace. And then the National Agriculture Federation, the Marketing Federation, NAFED, also had to step up because they had to procure pulses and supply 1 kg to 100 million households. So those are some of the examples from India. In Iran, they have a lot of clothing cooperatives, and they stopped their usual production line to get into the supply of masks. In Iran, you also have cooperatives which are in the petrochemical sector. They also had to change their production line and go into sanitizers. So again, in terms of immediate response. In Japan, you have a number of university cooperatives. I think Japan is one country where in the universities, cooperatives are quite active in terms of supplying not only stationery and consumable items, but they're also involved in housing, insurance. And this is the time when a new batch comes in, and because of the lockdowns and emergency, the university cooperatives had to step up and get the new students and the current students connected. And so the onboarding again had to happen online. In the Philippines, cooperatives set aside a certain percentage of fund towards education. So you have the education fund. So there they were able to talk to their regulator, the Cooperative Development Authority, and say that they could use that fund to meet the needs of members in terms of it could be food supply, it could be health kits. So that's another way in which in the Philippines, some of the members have asked the regulator to change. And of course, in Singapore, it's an interesting example where training and education is considered as an essential service by the government. And one of an affiliate of the federation, NTUC, which is a very large cooperative into in the consumer sector, they are into education and training. And so they've got into training of members across cooperatives, and they are looking ahead. It's not training just on what they were doing, but saying, okay, which are the sectors which are going to open up post the COVID, which are going to emerge. And so they are training their members so that they'll be ready. And the dual advantage of this is the government of Singapore is paying money for employees to attend training. So the NTUC, the Learning Hub, gets money for that. But it's not just money being given out, but you're getting your employees trained. So there is a dual benefit of not only getting to retain and pay your employees, but you also are training them and equipping them. I have not seen that in many countries. In many countries, you just have the government says we provide 80% wage or some kind of a package which comes like in the US. But this is tying it up that you'll get something, but you need to also step up. And so it shows how they are preparing ahead. And I think that's a good example. And when we come to the new normal, for me, it's looking at awareness. We need to, the whole issue about social distancing, taking care of our health, maintaining distance is, I think, a new normal. It's going to be with us. So how do we continue to make people aware of that, to continue maintaining this? I was reading an article today. Even the most magazines and newspapers which are free market oriented, you can take The Economist, you can take the Financial Times, they're also talking about in terms of we can't go back to what we were doing before. They are saying governments need to play a more active role. And these are newspapers and magazines which have said government should stay away. And they are talking about inequality that we need to address. So we need to look at the alternatives in terms of lifestyle changes and how we respond to these alternatives. And cooperatives, I think, need to put themselves out there saying we provide the alternative. We are not talking the market driven, but we are more member focused, community focused. So how do we promote ourselves as alternatives? How do cooperatives also change their approach? I think this pandemic has also shown that you can't just be in your silos. You have the agriculture producer cooperatives which were facing issues around markets. So the consumer cooperatives are the link, and in between are the credit cooperatives. So how do we work as an ecosystem? I think our approach needs to change. And of course, we need to be looking at in terms of how do we adopt new technologies, because that's going to be something which everyone needs to be looking at when the absence of physical meeting and contact. How do we also look at issues around what I would term as access? We've seen that we need to have universal health access. Basic income is being talked about. So how do we look at that? And finally, how do we adopt new ways of doing things? It's looking at technology, it's looking at a whole bunch of issues. So I think these are the whole set of issues which we need to be looking at in terms of the new normal, which we talk about.
Sir, next question will be, can you share some of the best practices cooperatives are dealing with, especially those cooperatives in the food sector, food in general, and we can be dairy sector, to meet the demand and supply challenges?
Earlier, I mentioned that agriculture and allied, that includes dairy and other sectors, were considered essential, and they have really stepped up. India is a very good example where Amul is and other federations have ensured that milk supply has been regular. There's been no disruption, not just for the consumer side, but also on the producer, the farmer side, in terms of collecting and ensuring the prices are also maintained. Unlike in Europe, when you look at Europe, there's a big issue in terms of not being able to procure, the prices are not stabilized. So when you compare that, the dairy sector has done very well in India. But at the same time, I think we see that small farmers have had issues around access to market. And then because of hotels being shut down, restaurants being closed, that usually is a big source of procurement for farmers. That's affected, and they are also much higher value. So that has had an impact. And of course, there are plants and flowers that also are a big source of income with the cancellation of weddings and other events. there's been a drop, and also temples being closed, all religious establishments being closed. So the demand for flowers and plants and things has come down drastically. And with school closures, schools in many countries, milk is an important thing which students are supplied. Uh, and food also is supplied through the midday meal scheme. So while agriculture is essential, it's helped the urban consumer in terms of being able to get their daily need. But then a whole bunch of industries which are associated with it has got affected. And and I think for across the region, we've had cooperatives step up in different ways. For example, in Australia, you have the apex body called the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals, and they were among the first to react when the situation as it was evolving. They got themselves in the table with other bodies representing agriculture and other sectarian and other sectors in conversation with the government to be able to sit around the same table and be able to tell the government what kind of supply chain issues were there and what they should be doing. So that was at a macro level. In India, IFCO, which I mentioned earlier, the fertilizer cooperative, they ensured that all their plants were running. Even though there was lockdown in the cities, agriculture was still happening. Farmers were still continuing to plant and things. So for that, you needed the essentials like fertilizers and other input. So IFCO ensured that there was no stoppage and the farmers were getting what they needed. That was on the input side. In Nepal, the Nepal Agricultural Cooperative Federation, which is the apex body for small farmers, they rallied and made sure that they were able to procure the produce from the farmers. And even before this pandemic, they had started to set up shops which were linking farmers directly with the consumers. So they were able to ensure that there were outlets available where farmers' produce was sold. There was another interesting example from Palestine. Again, Palestine land is a big issue because of the occupation and the things which are happening there. So land is scarce and farmers were not able to go out to the field. So the government said that we should start encouraging household gardening. And so the cooperatives there stepped up and said, we will take on around 10,000 women and supply them with seeds so that they can get into urban household gardening. So that I think was another interesting example in terms of how cooperatives in the region have stepped up. And some countries have started to look ahead. For example, in Japan, they are planning to start the Go-To campaign. And they're hoping that once restaurants and other things open up, more and more they would like to encourage more people to go to these restaurants and things. So they're already preparing for that. And cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives are going to be in the forefront as part of the Go-To campaign. So we've seen a range of responses from across our members in terms of being able to link the needs of the producers and the consumers and ensuring that the supply is maintained.
Sir, next question will be, we get to hear that a lot of cooperatives have contributed to the COVID fund in their respective countries to deal with. Can you share some of the light that how many cooperatives and major cooperatives have contributed to the respective funds?
Yeah. I think that's been an immediate response which many of our members across the region have done. There have been, like we talked, there are these stimulus packages which governments have been putting in place. So our members have tried to see that how do you make sure that cooperatives are included in that. It's in terms of not just financial contribution, but also you need to be able to access funds which are available. The stimulus packages are meant to stir up and drive up the demand in the country. And we've had good examples from the Philippines. There they have been able to, again, work with the regulator and get cooperatives recognized as part of the mainstream, not just on the margins, but also when the government is talking about the private sector, when the government is talking about certain sectors, that they specifically mention about cooperatives. So in the Philippines, they've done a good job. Yesterday, we had a board member from Malaysia, and he was mentioning that the government in Malaysia has put in place a couple of stimulus packages, and one of them specifically looks at families below the poverty line. And in Malaysia, the focus of cooperatives or the mandate given to them is to ensure that families below the poverty line are taken care of. So again, as part of the stimulus package in Malaysia, cooperatives have been recognized. In terms of contribution in India, the cooperatives have stepped up, and many have contributed to the PM CARES fund. Close to cooperatives together, I think, have contributed more than $6 million to the PM CARES fund. And of that, IFCO itself has contributed around $3.5 million. So that's a big amount. In Nepal, similarly, the cooperatives have come together and set up a cooperative fund, which is able to, and they've used this fund to set up a health center. So it's not just giving the money, but using the money to set up a health center. In Indonesia, the cooperatives again have set up an Islamic fund to be able to get their members to contribute. So I think the contribution has been both in terms of the cash, which is important, but also in terms of where cash is available or where stimulus is available to ensure that cooperatives are put right in the center and are able to access it.
Sir, what would be your recommendation to the state, to the various governments, especially in the post-COVID period, because the cooperative have played a quite critical role during this pandemic? What would be your inputs or recommendation to the state government in the post-COVID phase?
I think if you take India as a good example, and it's a good example, where the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi has come out with a clarion call saying that Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India is what we should be. And within that, the slogan is be more vocal with local products. And when we look at local, there can be nothing more local than cooperative products. So I think that itself we need to be capitalizing on, saying cooperatives are local, and what we come up with is what we need to be more vocal about. Following the Prime Minister's announcement, the Honorable Finance Minister has come out with pronouncements of packages, and there have been 5. It's been announced in 5 tranches. The third one in particular, which is of more relevance to cooperatives, is in the area of agriculture and allied industries, where she announced in terms of setting up the infrastructure fund to set up warehousing and processing and other centers. They've also deregularized certain sectors which were more controlled. Now it's being eased. And they've also opened up in terms of market access for the farmers. And I think here it's up to, and they've also specifically mentioned that the PAC, the Primary Agricultural Cooperative Societies, the farmer producer organizations, the self-help groups have a role to play. So I think earlier we used to say that we are not mentioned, we are part of a larger thing, there's no specific mention. So now that in this financial tranche, the cooperatives and allied collectives have been mentioned, I think it's up to us to see how well we can capitalize on this. And one of the reasons is that there's going to be more and more of the private companies, individuals coming in to directly deal with the farmer. Now it's quite open. So rather than have them deal one-on-one, which can place them in a much more precarious situation, I think collectively organizing them and being able to negotiate, I think that's a very important role which cooperatives can play. And we have examples across the region. If you look at Thailand, contract farming is huge, and cooperatives there play an important role. Similarly, in Vietnam, there are a large number of cooperatives come together, but the VCA, which is the apex organization, acts as the link between the industry and the cooperatives to ensure that the terms are in favor of the farmers to the extent possible. So I think the onus is on cooperatives and representative organizations to see how best they capitalize on this. But the one thing which I wanted to touch upon, and this relates to what I had mentioned earlier, in terms of this gives us the opportunity, new opportunity for cooperatives to put our presence out in new areas. And for me, one is in the whole area of micro, small, medium enterprises, small enterprises. And that's where the finance minister had announced the first tranche. And there's a lot happening there in terms of changing the definition of what investment amounts for MSMEs, what their turnover, and also it's trying to do away with the manufacturing and services side. So it's all more and more emphasis is being given there. And when I look at this sector, I find that the cooperatives are missing. And that for me is a bit of an, it's where I think we need to play a role, because when you look at the definition of what a cooperative is, the ICA definition is that cooperatives is a group of people coming together voluntarily and looking to put their money for to meet their common needs in a more autonomous and democratic enterprise. So the enterprise is very specifically mentioned in the ICA definition of a cooperative. And even in India, when you look at how cooperatives are defined, they are looked at as economic entities. So they are part of this enterprise and economic activity sector. And there are many cooperatives in the, when you look at the industrial cooperatives, there are producer cooperatives, which also deal with plants and equipment and machinery. And maybe I've not noticed, but in the tranche which has been announced, I didn't find specific mention about the handicrafts and the handloom sectors, which again is a big component of the micro sector. So in all this, I have not seen cooperatives mentioned there. And I think this is again an opportunity for us to get to interact with the government and also see that they can change how their outlook about cooperatives is. It's not just, yes, we need to be looking at agriculture and allied sectors, but in the services sector also, I think there is more need for bringing people together, and cooperatives can definitely make use of this opportunity which has been provided. And we see across in Europe, when you look at Europe, cooperatives are considered as part of the MSMEs, and you have clusters formed which are able to, cooperatives not only come together in terms of production, but also marketing. And I did mention earlier that in the Philippines, cooperatives are considered as part of the MSMEs. In Malaysia, cooperatives come under the Ministry of Entrepreneurship. So they are again at the center of it. In Indonesia also, the ministry is called Ministry of MSMEs and Cooperatives. Though at times they tend to look at two as distinct, but again, they come under the same umbrella. So when in many countries, cooperatives are looked at as enterprises, in India, we still continue to not look at them. And when we look at future opportunities, be it when you talk about startups or any other kind of ventures where young people are interested, the cooperative form of model is missing in the conversation. I think this is a terrific opportunity for us to capitalize upon.
So this brings us to my last question, basically, essentially, how in the post-COVID phase, the International Cooperative Alliance is going to engage with the cooperatives and establishing network with the cooperatives. How is it going to change in the next phase?
Yeah, I think that's something which we need to, we've started in terms of actively relooking at what we need to be doing. And it's already started. We've had, I mentioned about the online board meetings. And we've also had a webinar. We've started doing some webinars. And tomorrow we'll be having one on technology and cooperatives, because that's a whole area where cooperatives are deficient. We say that we need to adopt more technology. So this webinar is going to bring in experiences from Singapore, India, Iran, Indonesia. And we need to be looking at which areas are the emerging, where we need to be doing more. And I think technology is one area where we need to do more. Given a large part of what we were used to do is in terms of bringing our members together, either for training or for having some seminars and workshops. So travel is going to become a big issue in terms of not in a country. In a country, I think travel will ease, but if you're looking at going across borders, it's going to be an issue. But I see that, again, there are sub-regions where it will be much more easier for people to travel. If I look at ASEAN, they should be much more allowing their members to travel across, similar to the European Union. It's much easier for EU countries to travel. So ASEAN, you should have something similar. And same I can see with the Gulf cooperating countries. So we need to be looking more at sub-regions. We were doing that before in terms of trying to, we are quite active in South Asia and Southeast Asia, but we were looking to see how we can develop the Pacific countries, the Central Asian countries. So more emphasis will go in terms of developing sub-regions. We also need to be looking at ourselves as more knowledge-based. How do we come up with more knowledge products which members can use? And I think a lot of work can go into developing maybe online curriculum, online trainings. So these are areas I think where in the absence of a physical contact, how do we get this more online? And online is also has the flexibility that you are not limited in terms of coming and sitting in a class. You could do it at your own pace. So how do we make advantage, not just saying one-time training, but a way in which a member can get trained on their own time? And we also need to be engaging, looking at new areas and promoting the cooperative presence. And in India, especially trying to look, I mentioned earlier, the whole services sector, cooperatives are missing. And when we talk about farmer-producer organizations, why can't we talk about service provider organizations where you have, say, a group of security guards? They come together and form a collective and then are able to better negotiate. So I think the whole services area is something which is an area where we need to do more. So we'll be looking at newer areas in terms of how we improve the presence of cooperatives. And of course, we also need to be engaging with institutes similar to the VKCoE and IRMA in terms of seeing how we can look ahead and see how we can work together in terms of being able to respond to the needs of our members across the region.
Thank you so much for such enriching interactions. Now I hand over to Professor Mishra.
Yeah, Mr. Balu, it is always a pleasure talking to you personally or in a forum. Same energy is still there with you. I hope you continue engaging with us, especially at VKCoE and IRMA. From VKCoE, I always offer, on behalf of VKCoE, I always offer our cooperation and engagement, academic, research, or otherwise, in addition to training. And in today's context, you actually brought up variety of issues as well as the knowledge thereof. It has been very enriching to understand that basically we always demarcate or put up a borderline between enterprise and cooperatives. We always talk about the societal effect, but we do not think of social enterprises. So various forms are coming up, even at times ignoring the basic structure of cooperatives. Think about producer companies, you are producer groups. They carry on the same flavor that cooperatives have been nurturing so far. It is high time that government understands all these and do not reinvent the wheel in various forms, and forgetting the original form that has given results and been given results. So we are very very apt in saying that this has to go to the government and see that this is the right time that we actually frame a policy where enterprise driven approach should be given to the cooperatives as well. So the another issue that came up that very interesting, the fund that we are talking about, it is very essential that reserve to meet such type of eventualities should come up in as a policy level, and if members contribute to their own reserve, that's the best part that we can think of. So these things are these things that we talked about are really very pertinent, and you brought us various possibilities across the globe, especially Asia Pacific region. Hopefully, we shall engage in better forms when you come back to India, and we invite you to be quicker than ever. And we are interested to meet you in person. Thank you very much for giving us your insights. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.